backhand index pointing right, the science behind prison food, keeping inmates alive, not happy. The tray that broke the silence. The steel tray slid through the slot with a sharp clang. Inside the cell, an inmate lifted the lid and froze. The so-called meal looked more like scraps scraped from the bottom of a cafeteria bin. A lump of soy-based loaf, dry bread that crumbled to dust, and a scoop of beans that smelled sour. He stared at it in disbelief. "This is food," he whispered to himself. Later that night, his stomach cramped so badly he doubled over on the thin mattress, sweat dripping from his face. Around him, other inmates banged on their doors, yelling and cursing about the same thing. It wasn't just bad food. It was food designed to do one thing: keep them alive. Nothing more. The shocking part? Scientists, dietitians, and prison officials had worked together to make these meals as cheap, controlled, and unappetizing as possible. The science wasn't about joy. It wasn't about taste. It was about calories, survival, and control. But how did prison food get this way? And why is it built more like an experiment than a meal? That's what this story is about. The birth of prison food science. Decades ago, prisons faced a problem. Feeding thousands of inmates 3 times a day was expensive. Too expensive. Governors and prison boards wanted costs cut down. The question became, how can we keep prisoners alive without spending more than a few dollars a day? This is where nutrition scientists entered the picture. They studied the human body like a machine. They asked, what is the minimum amount of protein, carbohydrates, and fat a person needs not to die? The answer was shocking. They realized you could strip meals down to basic fuel, just enough calories to keep the body running, but without pleasure, without comfort, without dignity. This is how Nutraloaf was born, also known as the disciplinary loaf. A tasteless brick made of beans, vegetables, flour, and mystery leftovers. It had everything a body needed on paper, but it was dry, flavorless, and humiliating to eat. Inmates hated it. Guards used it as punishment. Courts even had to step in when prisoners argued it was cruel and unusual. But still, the loaf survived, hidden under different names. The science was clear: prison food wasn't designed for happiness. It was designed to keep the human body barely running, like a car with just enough gas not to stall. But the question is, what happens when people are forced to live this way for years? The first answer came one winter morning, when dozens of prisoners suddenly refused to eat. The first hunger strike. It started quietly. One inmate slid his tray back under the door, untouched. Then another. By the next meal, entire cell blocks were refusing food. The protest spread like wildfire. The inmates weren't demanding steak dinners or fancy meals. They wanted something far more basic, food that didn't feel like poison. For the guards, this was dangerous. Hunger strikes mean weakness, chaos, and headlines. The prison doctor warned, if this continues, we'll have deaths on our hands. Administrators panicked. But instead of giving in, they called the food contractors. Their message was cold and scientific. Recalculate the portions. Add more vitamins if needed, but don't raise the cost. So the meals were re-engineered. Powdered eggs, soy patties, and fortified drinks replaced anything fresh. On paper, the science showed inmates were getting their nutrition. But in reality, their bodies told a different story: diarrhea, headaches, weight loss. That night, an inmate collapsed in the shower. His friends screamed for help, pounding on the bars. Guards dragged him out, his lips pale, his body shaking. The science behind prison food was working, but only just. And what happened next would prove that this system wasn't about health at all. It was about control. Food as a weapon. The warden's office buzzed with arguments. Guards warned that hunger strikes could turn violent. Administrators worried about lawsuits. But instead of listening to the cries from the cells, prison leadership discovered something darker. Food could be used as control. The idea was simple. If you behave, you eat. If you break the rules, you don't. Meals became bargaining chips, not rights. One inmate, a lifer named Morales, learned this the hard way. After shouting at a guard, his dinner tray never arrived. The next morning, breakfast was forgotten too. By the third day, Morales was desperate. His hands shook, his skin looked gray. Finally, a guard slid him a single Nutraloaf brick through the slot. No water, no sides, no dignity. The message was clear: submit or starve. But not everyone broke. Some inmates found ways to push back. A calm period followed, where prisoners learned to trade and stretch what little they had. One man would save his bread, another would stash packets of peanut butter from commissary. Together, they built makeshift meals inside their cells. It was a survival game, one that taught them to rely on each other, not the system. For a while, tensions eased. But deep under the surface, anger brewed. That anger finally exploded one afternoon in the chow hall. A tray of spoiled beans was slapped down in front of an inmate nicknamed Spider. The smell was unbearable. He stood up, shouting, "They're feeding us garbage like we're animals." In seconds, trays flew through the air, beans and bread splattering the walls. Dozens of men jumped onto tables, fists pounding, voices echoing through the concrete hall. Guards rushed in, batons swinging, alarms blaring. The chow hall became a war zone. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about respect. And for the first time, prison officials realized their carefully calculated science experiment was about to ignite a fire they couldn't control. After the riot, the chow hall still smelled of beans and sweat. Broken trays littered the floor. Guards dragged away inmates one by one, their wrists zip-tied, their faces smeared with food and blood. The riot was over. But the silence that followed was worse. Inmates were locked down 23 hours a day. Chow hall privileges were suspended. Instead of hot meals, trays slid under the doors, bland soy patties, cold bread, powdered juice. The portions were smaller, the taste even worse than before. Officials called it a reset. But the prisoners knew it was punishment. The riot had given the system a reason to cut deeper. For a while, things seemed calm. The halls were quiet. Inmates chewed slowly, their anger buried behind blank stares. Commissary became the only relief. Packets of ramen, instant coffee, candy bars. Traded like currency, smuggled like treasure. One man whispered through the vents, "Bro, this ain't food. This is survival fuel." The system's science was working exactly as designed. Calories balanced, vitamins calculated, costs slashed. On paper, every inmate was fed. But in reality, their hunger wasn't just in their stomachs, it was in their minds. Then came the breaking point. One evening, an inmate named Tucker peeled back the lid on his dinner tray. A green, slimy film covered his beans. The stench made his cellmate gag. Tucker snapped. He hurled the tray at the steel door, beans splattering the wall like paint. He screamed until his voice cracked, fists pounding the bars. His rage echoed down the tier, cell after cell joining in. The prison lit up with noise, pounding metal, furious voices, a thunderstorm of rebellion behind concrete walls. Food had gone from survival to the spark of another war. Food as psychology. The warden held an emergency meeting. Riot reports stacked high on his desk, photographs of splattered beans and broken trays spread out like evidence. His voice was firm. If food is the trigger, then food will be the weapon. Prison officials contacted their nutrition contractors. The instructions were cold. Cut down the flavor. Strip away the comfort. Keep it measurable, balanced, and bland. The goal isn't happiness. The goal is compliance. Soon after, new menus appeared. Gone were the occasional fruits or fresh vegetables. In their place came powdered mixes, rehydrated beans, and soy-based patties stamped into identical shapes. Everything was standardized, portioned, and tasteless. The science behind it was chilling. By reducing food to numbers, calories, protein grams, vitamin percentages, officials believed they could keep inmates alive but emotionally drained. One prison doctor even explained, "Hunger weakens the body. Flavorless food weakens the mind. Together, they weaken rebellion." For a while, the system seemed to work. Inmates chewed their dry bread in silence. No riots. No hunger strikes. Just rows of tired men, their faces blank as they forced down another spoonful of gray stew. But under that calm, cracks began to show. Some prisoners grew dangerously thin. Others traded half their trays for a single packet of ramen from commissary. One inmate was caught licking toothpaste off his toothbrush just to trick his stomach into thinking he'd eaten. It was survival stripped to its bones. And then, the experiment went too far. One night, a guard made his rounds and found an inmate slumped over in his cell. The untouched tray lay beside him. Cold bread, cold beans, cold silence. The man's chest barely moved. He had collapsed from malnutrition and dehydration. Alarms rang. Medics rushed in. The prison's scientific diet had finally pushed a body past the edge. The shocking truth could no longer be hidden. Prison food wasn't just keeping inmates alive. It was slowly breaking them. The underground kitchen. When the news spread about the inmate who collapsed, fear ran through the prison. But fear turned into something else: resourcefulness. Prisoners realized they couldn't depend on the trays. If the system gave them tasteless survival rations, they would build their own way of eating. The calm before the next storm. It started small. A packet of ramen traded for a spoon of peanut butter. A candy bar exchanged for 2 slices of bread. Commissary became a lifeline, a black market supermarket where prices weren't set by guards, but by demand. Inmates turned into chefs with nothing but hot water, plastic bags, and ingenuity. They made prison pizzas from crushed crackers and ketchup. They stirred ramen soups into thick stews, adding whatever scraps they could get their hands on. Food wasn't just survival anymore. It was culture, comfort, even defiance. One inmate whispered through the bars, "They can control the trays, but they can't control what we cook for ourselves." But with power came danger. Commissary trades grew larger, debts stacked up, and fights broke out. A missed payment over 2 candy bars could spark violence. One night it did. 2 inmates argued in the day room over a stash of ramen packs. Voices rose, hands clenched into fists. Suddenly, a shank flashed. Within seconds, the floor was stained red. Guards swarmed in, alarms blared, and both men were dragged away in chains. The warden's report called it an isolated incident. But everyone inside knew the truth. Prison food had created its own black market, one just as dangerous as the gangs. The science had tried to strip food down to survival. Instead, it had turned food into power. The crackdown. The stabbing in the day room sent shockwaves through the prison. The warden stood before his staff and slammed his fist on the table. "Food has become a weapon," he barked. "Shut it down." Orders spread fast. Commissary limits were slashed. No more bulk ramen, no more candy stashes, no extra peanut butter packs. Guards searched cells daily, tearing apart beds and flipping lockers, looking for hidden soups and snacks. The underground kitchen was being dismantled piece by piece. The calm before the storm. For a few weeks, silence returned. Inmates chewed their trays of soy loaf in bitter quiet. Some tried to rebuild trades with smaller items. A coffee packet here, a slice of bread there. But the days of prison feasts and ramen stews were gone. One man muttered under his breath as he lifted his spoon of watery beans. "They've taken everything. Even our taste." On paper, the prison food science looked perfect. Calories balanced, costs cut, violence reduced. But under the surface, pressure built like steam in a locked pot. That pot finally exploded during a routine lunch service. An officer slid trays through the slots, one after another. In one cell, an inmate named Holloway looked down at his meal, gray loaf, stale bread, and a drink that smelled faintly of bleach. He snapped. With a roar, he hurled the tray back through the slot, beans splattering the officer's uniform. Within seconds, other cells joined in, trays slamming against doors, food smeared across walls. The block erupted in chaos. Guards rushed in with shields and pepper spray. Alarms wailed. Inmates covered their faces with wet rags, shouting through the haze. The battle wasn't about beans or bread anymore. It was about dignity, stolen one tray at a time. The science behind prison food had promised control. Instead, it had created another war zone. Science on paper, suffering in reality. When the riot smoke cleared, the official statement went out to the public. All inmates are being fed balanced, nutritious meals that meet daily requirements. Charts were shown. Calorie counts, vitamin percentages, protein levels. On paper, it looked flawless, a perfect system designed to keep inmates healthy. But inside those walls, the truth was very different. The calm before the storm. Inmates sat in their cells, staring at the trays with dead eyes. Meals had become predictable, mechanical. Gray loaf for breakfast, beans for lunch, soy patties for dinner. The taste was gone. The comfort was gone. Some prisoners tried to play along, forcing themselves to eat quickly and forget about it. Others simply pushed their trays aside, whispering through the vents. "This ain't food. It's punishment." Small rebellions grew quietly. Men saved crumbs of bread to trade. Others smuggled commissary packets in their shoes. A few even risked solitary by bribing kitchen workers for scraps of seasoning or sugar. It was calm, but it was a dangerous calm, the kind that always came before another eruption. The breaking point. One day, during dinner service, a guard delivered trays to a row of cells. When he reached the end, an inmate named Wallace stared down at his portion. The bread was moldy. The beans were cold. Wallace refused to touch it. Hours later, guards found him banging on the bars, demanding something edible. His voice echoed through the block. "You're not feeding us, you're starving us." Other inmates joined in, pounding their fists against the steel doors, voices rising like thunder. Guards tried to shout them down, but the noise only grew. The block shook with rage, the sound of men refusing to be silenced. That night, the prison shook, not from violence alone, but from the unbearable truth. Food, the most basic human need, had become the fuel for chaos. Liquid solutions. After the uproar, prison officials sat around a long table with state nutritionists. Their plan? Make the food system even harder to protest. The answer was powdered mixes and fortified drinks. Cheaper than cooking, easier to control. Soon, trays carried small cups filled with thick, chalky shakes, blended with vitamins, protein powder, and soy. They were cold, tasteless, and impossible to refuse. Guards could deliver them faster, and administrators bragged the liquid meals were scientifically balanced. The calm before the storm. For a short while, order returned. Inmates sipped the shakes quietly, some pinching their noses to choke them down. Others poured them onto the floor in silent protest. The prison doctor claimed the science was sound. "Every inmate now gets exactly what they need," he announced. "There are no deficiencies." But inside the cells, reality painted a darker picture. Stomachs twisted. Headaches spread. Men complained of constant nausea. Some grew weaker, their muscles fading. They weren't starving, but they weren't living either. One inmate scrawled on his wall with a dull pencil. "They don't feed us to live. They feed us to obey." The breaking point. Then came the incident that shook the block. During morning rounds, guards found an inmate collapsed on the floor, his cup of liquid meal spilled beside him. His lips were cracked, his skin pale. Medics rushed in, lifting his frail body onto a stretcher. As they wheeled him out, voices erupted from the cells. "Look at him. That's your science. Stop feeding us poison." The chants thundered through the corridors, bouncing off the steel walls. Guards scrambled to quiet the uproar, but it was too late. The very solution meant to silence protests had become the spark for something bigger. Food science had reached its breaking point. Desperate measures. The collapse of another inmate was the last straw. Prisoners realized they couldn't trust what came through the slot anymore. If the science of survival meant shakes, loaves, and powders, they would make their own food, even if it meant breaking every rule. The calm before the storm. Hoarding began in secret. Men hid bread under mattresses, stashed sugar packets in soap boxes, and collected peanut butter jars like gold. Smugglers moved quietly through the tiers, slipping commissary items from cell to cell in hollowed-out books or tied to strings passed through vents. The kitchen became the heart of a new underground. Some inmates bribed workers to sneak out spices, vegetables, even small cuts of meat. Others turned to brewing, using fruit scraps and sugar to create crude alcohol, not for pleasure, but to trade for real food. Cells smelled of ramen steam and hidden ferment. To the guards, it was contraband. To the inmates, it was survival. One prisoner whispered through the bars to his neighbor. They starve us, we feed ourselves. That's how we win. The breaking point. But with desperation came danger. Hoarded bread molded quickly, spreading sickness. Fermented drinks exploded in hidden bottles, flooding cells with sticky fumes. One night it went too far. Guards discovered a stash of spoiled meat hidden behind a vent. The smell was unbearable. By morning, several inmates were violently ill, clutching their stomachs, vomiting into buckets. Medics rushed in, but the damage was done. The underground kitchen had poisoned its own people. The irony was cruel. In their fight against prison food science, inmates had created a disaster worse than the meals they rejected. As word spread, the warden's message was cold and sharp. This is exactly why food must be controlled. The system tightened its grip once more. Solitary and science. The poisoning scare gave prison officials the excuse they'd been waiting for. The warden stood before the press and declared, "Unauthorized food practices are a threat to inmate safety. We will not allow it." Behind closed doors, the response was brutal. Anyone caught hoarding, smuggling, or trading food was shipped straight to solitary confinement. The calm before the storm. Cells in solitary were silent, cold, and bare. Meals came on paper trays, even smaller portions, no seasoning, no choice. Nutraloaf became standard. A dry, flavorless brick 3 times a day. The science said it was complete nutrition. But inmates in the hole knew the truth. It was punishment disguised as health. One man scratched words into his wall with a broken spoon. "Loaf is worse than hunger." Meanwhile, back in general population, the fear of solitary kept some in line. Trays were eaten quickly, quietly. The commissary market slowed. On the surface, order had returned. But hunger and humiliation don't vanish. They build in silence. The breaking point. One evening, guards delivered dinner to a man in solitary named Red. When he lifted the lid, another dry brick of Nutraloaf stared back at him. He laughed, a hollow, bitter laugh that echoed off the walls. Moments later, Red hurled the loaf at the steel door with such force it exploded into crumbs. He screamed until his throat went raw, smashing his fists against the concrete. His rage carried down the tier, other solitary cells joining in, pounding, shouting, voices rising in a storm of defiance. Guards rushed in with shields, dragging bodies through clouds of pepper spray. The riot wasn't in the chow hall this time. It was inside the very cells meant to silence them. Food, once again, had become the spark. The hard science diet. The solitary riot shook the system. Officials couldn't deny it. Food was no longer just fuel. It was fire. So they brought in state nutritionists once more. The goal? A diet impossible to protest. The new program was called the Hard Science Diet. Meals were reduced to the simplest forms: fortified bars, nutrient powders, and flavorless pastes. Every serving measured down to the calorie. No variety, no seasoning, no comfort. To the public, officials framed it as modern efficiency. Behind bars, it was another chain. The calm before the storm. At first, the prison grew quiet. Inmates choked down the bars and powders, their faces blank. Some stopped talking altogether. Others grew thinner, moving slower, their energy drained. The warden called it a success. "Violence is down," he reported. "The science works." But inside the cells, despair deepened. Meals no longer looked like food. They looked like experiments. Men whispered to each other through vents. "They don't feed us as humans. They feed us like lab rats." The silence was heavy. Too heavy. And silence in prison is never safe. The breaking point. One night, during evening rounds, a guard stopped at a cell and froze. An inmate had smeared the nutrient paste across the wall, spelling out one word in thick, sticky letters. "Starving." By morning, dozens of cells echoed with banging and shouting. Paste and bars were hurled at doors, smeared across walls, stomped into the ground. Inmates screamed through the tears, "Feed us real food. Stop the science." The block roared like a thunderstorm trapped in concrete. Guards in riot gear flooded the halls. Pepper spray filled the air. The war over prison food had entered its darkest stage. The science that promised control was breaking the system apart. Survival at any cost. The nutrient bars and paste were supposed to end the chaos. But instead, they pushed men into unthinkable territory. When food becomes punishment, survival finds another way. The calm before the storm. At first, inmates tried to stretch what little they had. They watered down their shakes to make them last longer. They hid crumbs of bars under their mattresses for midnight hunger. Some even mixed toothpaste with water to trick their stomachs, numbing the feeling of emptiness. Whispers floated through the vents. "They're starving us slow. We eat what we can. Doesn't matter what it is." The breaking point. Then came the night that horrified even the guards. During a routine search, officers entered a cell and gagged at the smell. On the floor, inmates had been scraping paint chips off the wall, mixing them with water, trying to make something solid, something that felt like food. In another cell, a man was caught chewing on paper scraps, swallowing them piece by piece. His lips were cracked, his eyes glazed, but his hands moved steadily, desperate to keep his body occupied. The prison doctor shook his head. "They're not just hungry. They're broken." News of these acts spread through the block like wildfire. To some, it was madness. To others, it was resistance, proof that inmates would rather harm themselves than accept the science forced on them. The system had gone too far. And everyone knew the next eruption would be worse. The outside world looks in. The stories leaked slowly at first. Whispers from families during visitation, letters smuggled out in tiny handwriting. But soon, journalists began asking questions. Why were inmates collapsing? Why were they eating paste and loaves instead of meals? Was science being used to feed or to punish? The calm before the storm. Advocates demanded answers. Lawyers filed lawsuits, calling the food cruel and unusual punishment. News stations ran headlines. Prisoners fed like lab rats. The science of survival or starvation? Officials countered with polished statements. Every inmate receives balanced nutrition, they claimed. Charts were displayed again. Calories, vitamins, protein, all neatly aligned. On paper, it was perfect. But inside the walls, the men laughed bitterly. Balanced? One inmate scoffed. Balanced like poison. Still, for a brief moment, the outside pressure brought hope. Commissary was loosened, small menu changes were promised, and some inmates even dared to believe things might improve. The breaking point. That fragile hope shattered one evening when an entire block was served trays of spoiled stew. The smell of rot filled the hall. Guards demanded inmates eat anyway. The men refused. Trays were pushed back through the slots, untouched. The standoff grew tense. Guards shouted threats. Inmates shouted louder. Then in one cell, a man snapped. He smashed his tray against the wall, stew dripping down like sludge. His roar echoed. "Stop feeding us garbage." Dozens joined in, trays flying, fists pounding, voices rising into a storm. The prison went into lockdown again, alarms, pepper spray, shields. On the evening news, officials denied everything. But inside, the truth was undeniable. Science was no longer feeding prisoners. It was tearing the prison apart. Power on a tray. The spoiled food revolt was supposed to be the last warning. But in truth, it was just another round in a battle that never ends. Every tray that slid under a steel door carried more than calories. It carried power. Officials used food as control, reducing it to bars, paste, or bricks, stripped of taste, stripped of joy. On paper, they claimed it was science, efficient, balanced, nutritionally complete. But to the men inside, it was a daily reminder that their lives weren't valued. They weren't being fed to live well. They were being fed to survive, barely. The calm before the storm. For days after the revolt, silence lingered. Inmates chewed in bitterness. Guards walked the tiers with nervous eyes. The warden repeated his reports. The science works. The inmates are stable. But everyone knew stability was a lie. The air itself felt heavy, charged. One prisoner scrawled on the back of his tray with a dull fork. "Food is freedom." Another wrote across his wall. "Alive, not happy." the final breaking point. In the end, prison food was never about nutrition alone. It was about stripping away identity, dignity, and spirit. Each tasteless tray was a message: we control your body. We control your hunger. We control you. But the irony? The harder the system tried to control food, the more it exposed its own weakness. Because hunger, no matter how measured or manipulated, always finds a way to fight back. So the next time you see a story about prison budgets, about cost-effective nutrition, remember this: behind every scientific chart, behind every powdered shake or gray loaf, there's a man sitting in a concrete box, staring at a tray that tells him he is nothing more than numbers. Prison food was never designed to make anyone happy. It was designed to keep them alive, just enough to serve their time. But when survival is the only flavor, dignity becomes the hunger that never goes away. And that hunger is something no science can control.